of a series of science fiction books written in the 1950s by L. Ron Hubbard, but because of the way they treat children, because of the way they treat people who leave the faith, because of the way they treat people who don't want to offer up as much money as the church might want them to offer up. Tell us about the church, about its findings, and then transition us into this tax situation.
Well, as you said, the Church of Scientology was originally founded in 1950 by a man named L. Ron Hubbard when he wrote a book entitled Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, which was kind of a hilarious title, given that this man, L. Ron Hubbard, had absolutely no credentials. He had no business calling himself any kind of a medical professional of any kind. However, the book Dianetics was it was very popular. It went to it was on the bestseller list for many months, and I can go into as much detail as you want, but quite frankly, it was almost as if L. Ron Hubbard started a self-help movement and kind of became a self-help guru, even though that term wasn't popular back then. But his whole message was, with my teachings and with everybody else working together, we can improve you as a person. You can become more than just a regular person. You can improve yourself. And then, I can go on and on and on, but very simply put, L. Ron Hubbard then made a claim that Scientology, which morphed out of Dianetics, was a religion. And in 1957, the IRS granted Scientology tax exemption. And they held tax exemption from 1957 to 1967. And then the IRS rescinded Scientology's tax exemption, arguing that Scientology was violating what's known as the annulment clause of the 501c3. And what that means is that monies that were given, simply put, to Scientology were actually benefiting L. Ron Hubbard personally. He was just, and that's called annulment, which you're not allowed to do. So in 67, the tax exemption was rescinded. But the founder, L. Ron Hubbard, claimed that he shouldn't be paying in taxes. I can go into as much detail as you care to hear. But L. Ron Hubbard had a pathological hatred for the government and for taxation. So anyway, from 1967 onward, they did not have tax exemption, but they claimed that they should. Then in 1986, L. Ron Hubbard dies, and a man by the name of David Miscavige rises up to take over Scientology. And in 1986, again, simply put, what's known as the war with the IRS is launched, which included 2,400 lawsuits, advertisements that Scientology paid for in periodicals like USA Today, disparaging the IRS. And so this war went on. And then in 1989, there was a Supreme Court ruling involving Scientology, but the ruling was on our tax code. The ruling was issued June 5th, 1989. And then in a series of events that I would very much like to discuss with you, on the 1st of October 1993, the IRS reinstated Scientology's tax exemption, and they've enjoyed tax exemption from them until now. However, what I'm very much hoping to discuss with you is how, in fact, the IRS is presently violating the Supreme Court ruling. It's entitled Hernandez v. Commissioner. The IRS is 180 out violating this ruling, and how Scientology's tax exemption that was issued in 1993 is unconstitutional and unlawful. And kind of the bottom line up front, John, is that there is a crime in progress. And that crime is that the IRS is violating a Supreme Court ruling on our tax code, obviously. And Scientology enjoys tax exemption unconstitutionally and unlawfully presently. and I was hoping to discuss this with you and your audience, and if you appreciate matters of deep state activity, government agencies doing things that they're not supposed to, acting outside of their authority, acting outside of the law. And if that interests you, I have another case. I mean, you exposed what the CIA was doing down in Guantanamo outside of the law with the enhanced interrogations. And I'm here to discuss another one of these matters with you now.
Let's do that. Let's do that. Let's frame this too. This is a religion that many people consider to be a cult. It is very, very well funded because there's a certain kind of tithing where people, in many faiths, people give 10% of their incomes. It's not 10%. It's like everything you have in many cases with the Scientologists. And they've used that money to buy real estate. So they're very well represented in places like Southern California, Washington, D.C., where they have enormous compounds. But like you say, they're tax exempt. Now, there was a period in the 1970s and the 1980s where they actually had a program whereby they got church members to seek employment in the federal government, specifically in the IRS, so that they could spy on the government and report back to the Church of Scientology. Tell us about that, and then let's get into some of these substantive issues that you're raising.
Absolutely. So what you're referring to, it's called Operation Snow White, which ran from 1973 to 1977. This was a Scientology operation. And like you said, they encouraged members of their organization to get jobs within the federal government, in particular the IRS. And it was 5,000 people, John, that got jobs throughout the various government agencies, primarily the IRS. And they did it all. They stole documents from the IRS with the intent of disrupting the IRS's investigation into Scientology's tax exemption. They misfiled documents, which I would consider to be an act of sabotage. They did that with the IRS. Just skipping ahead, in 1977, the FBI raided Scientology, which is the largest raid in FBI history, which I was surprised to learn. I would think that the largest raid in FBI history would be against, some sort of a criminal group like the, narco groups or what have you, or terrorist
the John
groups.
Dillinger gang or something.
Yeah, but no, it was against the Church of Scientology, unbelievably. So, but let's see, some other things that they did, like for instance, they got a woman to get a job at the FBI office in Los Angeles, and she stole documents from the FBI office. She reported back to Scientology what the FBI agents were talking about. I forget the woman's name now, but I can find it and I'll email it to you. But she's given interviews about this, so it's I'm not talking out of turn. What else can I tell you? As you and I have discussed, we've met previously, obviously. I currently serve as a reserve naval intelligence officer. And I have my master's degree from the National Intelligence University. And so we studied at NIU, we studied infiltrations of the U.S. government, and we talked about the Rosenbergs, and we talked about Aldrich Ames. We talked about the Russian spy ring that was rounded up in 2010. I believe it was 2010. It was definitely under the Obama administration. And that was the largest spy ring that we ever talked about at NIU, was the Russians. And then when I started researching the Scientology group, and I discovered that they had infiltrated numerous government agencies with 5,000 of its members, I mean, I just fell out of my chair. I couldn't believe it. I mean, even at the National Intelligence University, this spy operation flew under the radar. Just some other agencies that they infiltrated. I believe they infiltrated the Coast Guard Intelligence Agency.
Why?
They did. Why? Well,
is it because they had, we should add too, they had this ship, and it belonged to a division of the church called the Sea Org, the Sea Organization. Mm-hmm. It spent a lot of time just outside of U.S. territorial waters. It was staffed largely by children. The children weren't educated. They were the children of Scientology members. And many of them, went through life never learning how to read and write. They were just taught to take orders from the Sea Org.
Yeah, that's another facet of all of this. There's been a lot of child abuse over the decades. People, they were born and raised in Scientology, and they get out and they don't know how to do things like open a checking account, get a credit card. They don't know about how to get a job, pay taxes. It's a very closed society. There are these compounds, as you mentioned, one in Southern California, just outside the town of Hemet. Another major compound is in, there's a big building called Pac Base, that they call it Pac Base. It's in Los Angeles. And then they have a very large property compound in Clearwater, Florida. But, yeah, they just live. I mean, they live in Scientology. They estimate that Scientology is worth, it's hard to pin down how much money they have, but it's about 3 to 5 billion. Is about the best guess that the internet has. And, they live in these communal, they're basically like motels that Scientology took over, and they live, 4 people to a room, and they live in these buildings, and they're fed by Scientology, and it's a great deal of abuse.
Jason, let me ask you, why is it that once you are a member of the Church of Scientology, that it's almost impossible to leave? And if you do leave, you have to escape. You can't just say, this isn't for me, and you just walk out the door. You have to escape, like in the dead of night. And then nobody in your family who is a member of the Church of Scientology can ever speak to you again. Why that kind of punitive secrecy?
Well, it really all goes back to L. Ron Hubbard. He was kind of a failure in life, and then World War II emerged, and he was an officer in the Navy during World War II, where he got a taste of power and authority, and he never could get rid of that taste in his mouth. He wanted power, he wanted authority, he wanted control over people, and if you look at Scientology, that desire for power manifested. Like, for instance, L. Ron Hubbard would often wear a naval-style uniform. You were talking about the Sea Organization staffing the ship that L. Ron Hubbard had for a long time, named the Apollo, and everybody dresses in Navy-style uniforms. Right. But you were asking, like, why is it that it's so difficult to leave Scientology? John, it's a prison of the mind. It's a belief that Scientology is your entire world. It's, for instance, Scientologists you have their own language, as many, like many industries do. Like, Intel people have their own verbiage, doctors have their own verbiage. Well, Scientology has its own verbiage. But it's sort of this belief that if you leave Scientology, your whole world is going to collapse. And unfortunately, for a lot of people, that's not exactly true. Or excuse me. For a lot of people, that's not exactly false. Because when they get out of Scientology, they're in their 40s and 50s sometimes.
And
they have
not
no
equipped.
education.
They're not equipped for life.
No, they have no education. They have no marketable job skills. They have no money, because when you're a member of the Sea Org, you don't get paid anything. It's anyway, you just don't get paid.
And in fact, you sign a 1 billion year contract.
Yep, that's certainly part of the what I would call the mind manipulation, because you see, Scientologists, they believe in reincarnation. So when you sign that billion-year contract, you're not just signing it for this lifetime, but many lifetimes to come. And so to leave all of this is very difficult. There was an interview by a former Scientologist who said, when you leave Scientology, the first thing you have to do is realize in your mind that you've been duped. That's the first step. And then it can be as much as a year or 2 later before they actually physically remove themselves. You were also talking about the shunning policy that Scientology has. They call it the disconnect policy, and it is. It's a shunning policy. If you leave the church, then your wife and your children and your brothers and your sisters, they'll stop talking to you. And the threat of losing your family, that's not a mind trap. That's a real trap. I mean, that can really, people don't want to lose their families. So they either, they stay in Scientology. There are basically three levels of Scientologists. The most inner is the Sea Org, that are like the clergy. Then there's what's known as staff, which are people that work at the Scientology churches, or orgs as they call them. And then there are the regular people who have regular jobs, and they go to Scientology to engage in Scientology teachings and trainings, all created by Hubbard, that they believe gives them spiritual comfort.
Jason, thank you very much. When we come back, we'll have more with investigative journalist Jason Polychron. I'm John Kiriakou, and this is The Deep State. Stay right there. Welcome back to The Deep State. I'm John Kiriakou. We're joined again today by our guest, investigative journalist Jason Polychron. I want to ask you about this tax situation. At first glance, it seems quite complicated. You and I have had this conversation offline. It actually isn't so complicated. It seems actually pretty clear that the government has dropped the ball here. And it's funny to me because the IRS especially is perfectly willing to go after someone who the IRS believes hasn't paid his or her fair share of taxes. But then you've got this multi-billion-dollar cult that gets away with whatever it wants to get away with. Can you walk us through this?
Well, yes. All right. So what happened was, in June 5th, 1989, the United States Supreme Court issued the ruling Hernandez v. Commissioner. Should I just talk to you about the Hernandez case?
Sure,
I think that's,
sure. Let's start with Hernandez.
Okay. And what it was, as I mentioned earlier, Scientology engaged in this 2,400 lawsuit war from 1986 to 1993. One of those lawsuits was filed by a Scientologist by the name of Hernandez. And sure enough, it went all the way to the Supreme Court. And in this ruling, the Supreme Court affirmed that quid pro quo transactions with religions are not tax deductible. Okay, so the IRS, or excuse me, so the Supreme Court ruled in the IRS's favor. But in fact, the Hernandez ruling was a real problem for the IRS. And the reason is that the IRS allows the quid pro quo transactions of other religions to be deducted, not in compliance with the law. The two biggest religions that this affects is the LDS Mormon religion, or to be more accurate, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I want to be polite, but for the sake of time, I'll just say the LDS Mormon religion, and the Jewish religion. Now, in our previous interview, I said that LDS Mormon people are obligated to pay tithing. Okay, I was a little bit loose with my words, and in the comments, people called me out on this. Let me clarify. In the LDS Mormon religion, if you want to get something called a temple recommend, you must pay tithing. But if you don't want the temple recommend, you don't have to pay tithing. The temple recommend gets you certain privileges and ceremonies within the LDS Mormon religion. I can go into more detail if you care to hear it. Okay. Now, the IRS presently allows LDS Mormon tithing to be deducted, but that's against the law. The IRS is not supposed to be allowing those deductions per the law and per the Supreme Court Hernandez ruling. And that is how, one way, the IRS is presently violating the Supreme Court Hernandez ruling. Okay. The other religion is the Jewish religion, which has what are called temple dues. Now, about 95% of Jewish synagogues charge temple dues, and they are mandatory. If you pay, you can come into the temple and receive services. If you don't pay, you can't come in. The IRS allows these temple dues to be deducted. And that's against the law, and it's against the Hernandez ruling.
Well, let me ask you
And
then, once Hernandez was decided by the court, why didn't the IRS just blanket change the policy? If the court came down so clearly that these were not deductible expenses on individuals' income taxes, why not just change the policy then and move on?
Well, legally they should have, but you know, this was going to cause all kinds of anger within the country. I mean, the IRS was going to face political backlash. They were probably going to get sued by LDS Mormon people and Jewish people, and there are other religions that are affected. And this was just going to be very unpopular. And I believe that the IRS just saw the Hernandez ruling and said, we don't want this to be true. We just don't want to deal with this mess. And I haven't spoken about this yet, but I'll get to it. But basically, the IRS just took the Hernandez ruling and threw it in the waste bin and just pretended that it didn't exist. Right. So your question was, why didn't they just do their jobs? I think they calculated doing their jobs was just going to be too much to deal with, and they just didn't want to.
And then how did the Church of Scientology react to that?
Okay, so when the Hernandez ruling came down, the Church of Scientology, but really its lawyers, realized that the IRS had a problem on its hands, that they were allowing these other religions to deduct their quid pro quo transactions. Okay, so Scientology filed 2 lawsuits. One is entitled Garrison v. Commissioner, that was filed in 1989. And then in 1990, they filed another lawsuit entitled Powell v. USA. And in these 2 lawsuits, the Scientologists, but really Scientology, argued something called administrative inconsistency on the IRS, saying you're allowing these other religions to deduct their quid pro quo transactions, but you're not allowing us. And the reason why they filed and sued for administrative inconsistency is because in her dissent, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, in her dissent in the Hernandez ruling, pointed this out. She was the one who used the term administrative inconsistency. She talked about LDS Mormon tithing, and then she talked about something called Jewish High Holy Day tickets. But if you look at the websites of most synagogues, they wrap up the High Holy Day tickets in the temple dues.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because that was one of the things I wanted to jump into right away. Alan Dershowitz, the famous, maybe infamous professor emeritus of law at Harvard University, and the mentor to Senator Ted Cruz, once said that Ted Cruz was the smartest student that he ever had. But then in a recent interview that I know, right? I got a chuckle out of it too.
It's hard not to giggle at that one, but yeah.
In a recent interview that Ted Cruz had with Tucker Carlson, he was intellectually unprepared for the questions that Tucker had for him about these very issues. Now, I'm a little bit embarrassed to tell you that years ago, I was an adjunct professor of intelligence studies at Liberty University, which is the biggest evangelical university in the world. I'm an Orthodox Christian, like you are. I'm not evangelical, but they liked my position on torture. They said that torture wasn't Christian, and would I like to teach these classes? I said, yes, I'm glad that I did. They were lovely people, but we had fundamental disagreements on the role of evangelical Christianity in the Middle East.
Yep.
I would posit that there is no role for evangelical Christianity in the Middle East, because evangelical Christianity, in my humble opinion, is an arm of Zionism. And so I was never able to wrap my head around how these Christians, or these people who call themselves Christians, with a straight face, can tell you that they're doing the right thing by supporting Israel as it wipes out ancient Christianity. Do you have any response to that? How is it that they're able to justify this policy to themselves?
Well, to quote John Hagee, against you, John, it's the blood moons. The blood moons of Israel show us that Jesus is not the Messiah. I couldn't resist throwing in a John Hagee.
John
impression.
Hagee.
Now,
Oh boy.
I was raised Southern Baptist, so I understand the mindset, and I can tell you that for many of the people in that milieu, it simply doesn't occur to them to think or question that way. They've never thought about what was Christianity like in the first 500,000 years of the church. What is the history of Christianity in the Middle East? For most Bible Belt, evangelical-minded people, as you would know from being at Liberty, I mean, it's just sort of a question they've never even entertained. And when I was 18 or 19, I remember buying my first Bible that I bought on my own that wasn't given to me by a Sunday school or whatever, was a prophecy study Bible. I remember buying it at a Christian bookstore, and I read it. I thought, oh, we're supposed to, just sort of default support the modern nation state of Israel because it's all this biblical prophecy stuff. And, we saw Trump a week or two ago saying, bless those that bless Israel. I will bless those. We all have a duty. Everybody has to support Israel no matter what. But that's all false, right? Because every one of the church fathers, 100% consistently across the board, all of those very people who put the Bible together, they were unanimous in their interpretation, like St. Paul in Galatians 6, the church is the spiritual Israel. So really it would be a kind of Judaizing move to go retrograde, to go back to the sort of Old Testament mindset, and to go back to what you said about the persecution of Christianity and sort of stamping it out in those cities. People need to understand, which I didn't understand when I was an evangelical Zionist, that rabbinical Judaism actually pronounces curses on what they call the minim. The minim are the Christians, and this goes back to the 2nd, 3rd century when there was this fissure between Judaism at that time, which was still proto-rabbinic Judaism, and Christianity going their separate ways. And part of what defines rabbinic Judaism is actually their anti-Christian stance. So that's what the attitude actually is. And if we understand that, I think most Bible Belt people think of Islam as a threat to the West. And I think that it is, as I've studied Islam in depthly the last 10 years or so. But they don't understand that it's the same idea, same ideology, perhaps even more vicious within the Talmudic and rabbinic teachings that really require serious practitioners of Judaism to use any means necessary really to get rid of Christianity. So, everything you said is correct, but I just simply think that the people in the Bible Belt probably just never even entertained these types of questions.
With this expansion of settlements, with war against Iran, it's not just against Iran, it's against Lebanon, it's against Syria, it's against Christians in the West Bank. What do you think of the notion that's floating around now that the Israelis have been emboldened to the point where they might even consider attacking or dismantling the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to then build the third temple, which they believe they are religiously driven to do, they've been commanded by God to do? Is that something that we should expect to see?
It's definitely a possibility. I think that if you study the history of Israeli operations, the Mossad, I'm certainly no expert. I've just read some books on it over the years. I don't think they would be at all beyond doing some sort of false flag or something like that. Right. It's very plausible, how they would go about that or how that might happen. They could just simply say that Iran shot a missile or something like that, or it could be a bomb goes off, blame it on whoever. It's certainly a possibility. And I think that, again, like we're saying with our previous audience of the sort of evangelical-minded people, they don't understand that there's the evangelical Zionist idea of the end times, and you have to kind of allow this stuff to happen, and Israel can do whatever it wants because they think this will further sort of the return of Christ and the rapture and the final millennium and all this kind of nonsense. But there's also the rabbinic idea, which is split between whether or not they have to be in the promised land and build the temple before the Messiah comes, or the other Orthodox Jews that think that they're not supposed to be there because the Messiah hasn't come. That's really a minority of them. So I think that, yeah, there's definitely a possibility that they could engage in some type of a false flag, for sure. I mean, Israel has a history of using false flags, just like many nations have. So absolutely.
Yeah, help me understand the ideology of evangelical Christians, especially in the United States, because a lot of these beliefs you mentioned, for example, the rapture. The rapture is a late 19th century, British American Protestant development. It doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible or the ancient writings, etc. I was talking to the daughter of a friend of mine who is an evangelical Christian and has volunteered to go overseas and do some missionary work. I asked her where she was going, and she said, North Macedonia. I said, why? She said, why not? I said, because they're already Christian. Why aren't you going to Africa, right? Or go to the Middle East somewhere? And she looked at me like I had two heads, because an Orthodox Christian's not a real Christian, right? I mean, isn't that what they're led to believe these days?
Absolutely. And to tie that in just briefly with what you mentioned earlier on, the idea that evangelical Christianity is also an arm of Zionism, and also an arm, I would argue, of the American Pentagon or deep state. There's a lot of history that goes into missionaries being used and recruited for intelligence work, for all kinds of stuff. Other countries, such as Russia, for example, ban groups like Jehovah's Witnesses or things like Scientology, because sometimes they're cut out, sometimes they're used for that stuff. So it's not just a matter of persecuting religious groups. It has to do, as you would know, with espionage. So there's that angle too, which the U.S. uses a lot of these evangelical groups for what it calls soft power, to try to promote American ideology in other countries. This was used heavily in the Ukraine, used heavily in the Cold War. There's giant historical, scholarly texts on that. But beyond that, I think you're right that for the evangelical mind, I don't think they would see these groups as really Christian. So they're just sort of nominally Christian or Christian in name. Funny you said that. I was actually on a evangelical guy's podcast the other day, and he was saying, I come from Lithuania. Everybody's nominally Christian. But in America, I really found evangelical true Christianity in it. I just thought I was like, well, but what makes that true? And he's like, well, I had this experience, right? So it's very experiential and emotionally based. It's not actually based in sort of ritual and tradition and history. There's a lot of emotivism involved in that sort of evangelical Bible thumping, Billy Sunday style revivalist stuff that goes back to, you could say, America's founding with Puritans and the New Light and all that. Anyway, your question, though, I think was more so about why do we have to do this missionary work when they're already Christian? And I think it's just a defective and sort of ignorant view of Christianity, and not understanding that a lot of this is geopolitics and a lot of this is groups being used, and they don't even understand that they're being used. And that's a huge challenge. I've been talking about this for a long time, and probably not going to convince a lot of people in the Bible Belt that that their churches are being used for Israeli foreign policy. But actually, from the Tucker interview, from the Tucker interview and the Tuckabee interview, they're actually becoming more and more aware that, Huckabee really had no idea what he was talking about, and Tucker really asked some pretty basic level questions, and there's a lot of fumbling. So this is causing quite a few people, I think, to at least maybe not get into the geopolitical stuff too heavy, but at least question, well, wait a minute, why are we supposed to do whatever Israel says? What does that have to do, with American foreign policy? And, here's Trump doing pretty good things the second round, and then suddenly everything's sort of going haywire once he's got to listen to whatever Bibi says.
Stay with us, Jay. We're going to take a short break and come right back. When we come back, we will have more with Jay Dyer. I'm John Kiriakou, and this is The Deep State. Stay right there. Welcome back to The Deep State. I'm John Kiriakou. We're joined back again today by our guest, Jay Dyer, podcaster, theologian, and expert debater. Thanks so much for being with us, Jay. You know, one of the things that has always struck me about evangelicals and their sort of religious political ideology is they believe they can force God's hand by encouraging Jews to move to Israel, for example, right? Because the Messiah can't come back until all the Jews have returned to Israel. But they just don't get that it's not up to man to make that decision and to force God's hand. They really believe that this is something that they can accomplish. And that's why they won't even engage you in a conversation about the rightness or the wrongfulness of a policy like that.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I actually challenged quite a few proponents of this over the last year or 2 years to a public debate. I had some back and forth with Dinesh D'Souza, who's a massive Christian Zionist, and of course he would not do it. He declined multiple times. Some of the other big evangelical megachurch pastors, I've tried to reach out and get them to have some kind of engagement or discussion. And of course, none of them would actually do it. So it was really surprising to me that Huckabee and what's his face were actually willing to do that interview, because it's almost like they were, I mean, it's like they live in another reality almost, right? And I say that because I grew up with Baptist pastors, and I think Mike Huckabee, in that interview, he came off as the archetypal Baptist pastor that I grew up with. And so to see that kind of an archetype, you know, really just sort of fumble and just sort of melt in the midst of that basic level of questioning was a huge blow. But yeah, I don't think that that those questions are ever asked by the evangelical mindset. But I'm glad that they're being forced to ask these questions now, because it's really, as you know, these are the types of things that can really undo the country.
Yes,
right.
Without a
and
doubt.
It doesn't mean that if we don't do Israeli foreign policy that we have to suddenly hate all Jews or hate people. Everything is always cast in a propaganda way, in a false dialectic of, oh, if you don't support whatever Bibi says, then you must hate all Jews or something like that. That's a false dichotomy. That's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow that because I don't want to do their foreign policy that I hate them, but it's just not rational. It's not Christian. It's not sensible. It's ahistorical. And like you said, you know, the whole rapture ideology was really invented and pushed by famous Zionists in America like Samuel Untermyer. He was a huge part of why Schofield was able to get that whole movement and idea going throughout the Bible Belt. And you know, you being Orthodox, you know, you don't think about it like a Baptist thinks about it, like where you grow up just reading this book, and sort of the book is sort of the end all be all, and you don't even think about, well, who put the book together and what's the history behind the book, right? And then when you start asking those questions, a lot of times, as I did in my 20s, it tends to lead you out of the Baptist mindset, and you begin to also realize, well, maybe this recent eschatological view of the rapture and the millennium and all that, maybe that's a new teaching. Maybe that's not actually a biblical ancient teaching. And when you realize that, you know, one of the most powerful verses, and I know this doesn't have to be a big theology chat, but in Matthew 21:43, Jesus gives a parable, and he says to the Jews, to the Pharisees, he says, the kingdom of God will be taken from you and given to a nation producing the fruits thereof. The nation there being, I think, the Gentile and Jewish church that was soon to emerge, which would supplant and really be the fulfillment of what the flesh nation state of Israel was. And I remember reading that as an evangelical Zionist, and I thought, man, this really doesn't work with my theology of when Jesus comes back, he'll set up that earthly kingdom in Israel, and we have to do what the nation state of Israel wants, because that's God's chosen people. Jesus is simply literally saying, no, in this first advent, this kingdom is taken from you. It's not your possession anymore. It's the church.
I want to ask you about an article that was published in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago. It was a fascinating piece to me, and it was essentially something that we Orthodox already knew, that there were more conversions from evangelical Protestantism in the United States to the Orthodox Church than to any other denomination or any other faith. And primarily that's because people are searching for tradition, right? They're searching for something with a history. If you're Orthodox, you've known that all your life. Especially the Antiochian Orthodox Church or the Orthodox Church in America. There are, in many parishes, majority converts that make up the parish. It's a wonderful thing. That's not how the New York Times meant it. The New York Times meant it to be that this was something that we should be worried about, because these converts to Orthodoxy are very conservative, and some of them are extremely right-wing or alt-right, and they believe, God forbid, they believe in a traditional home where the woman doesn't work outside the home, and other silliness through this article. A similar article was published in 2005 that didn't have all the negatives attached to it, but they were saying, you know, this Orthodox Church is something that's very appealing to people who feel like they're missing something in evangelical Christianity, especially in the United States. Why do you think that there was this pushback against Orthodoxy by a mainstream outlet like the New York Times? Why wouldn't they have presented this as, hey, there's something interesting going on in the religious community in America, here's what it is? Why was this something that we should fear?
The establishment left in America, and particularly through the outlets like New York Times and even the fake conservative outlets. I've been approached a lot of DMs from Wall Street Journal, these types of organizations that have reached out to say, hey, you know, you end up doing a lot of these debates. I'd like to talk to you about why Orthodoxy is growing and this and that. There's probably been 5 or 10 of those over the last several years. And I always say no, because I know that they're going to write a hit piece and try to say
yes,
that I'm a follower of, you know, Tiny Mustache Man, even though I critique
right.
eugenics and that whole ideology all the time. So I tend to just assume that they're going to be hit pieces. And I did see what you're talking about. And I think that, you know, from the vantage point of the establishment, they're always interested in what the intellectual currents are, what the reaction will be to the prevailing status quo. And so they're probably looking to see what the trend is and why is this trend happening? Who's the voices of this? So I think they're probably figuring out who to target, who to try to take down, who to, you know, make look bad. And they always default to the same really weak ad hominems that just don't work anymore.